Good morning. I'd like to share with you this morning out of 2 Samuel, chapter 23. It's got some difficult names in this section, so I'm going to try and do my best and read the first 17 verses too. So if you can try and follow this. This is about David's mighty men. These are the names of David's mighty men. Josheb-Bashebeth, a Tahechumite, was chief of the 3. He raised his spear against 800 men, whom he killed in one encounter. Next to him was Eleazar, son of Dodai, the Ahoahite. As one of the 3 mighty men, he was with David when they taunted the Philistines gathered at Pas Dammim for battle. Then the men of Israel retreated. But he stood his ground and struck down the Philistines till his hand grew tired and froze to the sword. The Lord brought about a great victory that day. The troops returned to Eleazar, but only to strip the dead. Next to him was Shammah, son of Agi the Harite. When the Philistines banded together at a place where there was a field full of lentils, Israel's troops fled from them. But Shammah took his stand in the middle of the field. He defended it and struck the Philistines down, and the Lord brought about a great victory. During harvest time, 3 of the 30 chief men came down to David at the cave of Adullam, while a band of Philistines was encamped in the valley of Rephaim. At that time, David was in the stronghold, and the Philistine garrison was at Bethlehem. David longed for water and said, "Oh, that someone would get me a drink of water from the well near the gate of Bethlehem." So the 3 mighty men broke through the Philistine lines, drew water from the well near the gate of Bethlehem, and carried it back to David. But he refused to drink it. Instead, he poured it out before the Lord. "Far be it from me, O Lord, to do this," he said. "Is it not the blood of men who went at the risk of their lives?" And David would not drink it. A few years ago, we were very fortunate enough to have a short break in the city of Krakow. I'm not sure whether any of you have been there in Poland. It's a medieval city. It's now probably most famous because it's very close to Auschwitz. And also, there's the factory that Oskar Schindler ran. And when we were there, we went to see the factory. And it's very, very moving and upsetting. Because as you know the story of Oskar Schindler, how he saved about 1,200 Jews from the concentration camps. He's a very famous man, isn't he? But I wonder, have you ever heard of anybody called the Bielski brothers? Has anybody ever heard of them? Yeah? If you imagine a map of Europe, next to Poland, you've got Belarus, and then you've got Russia. Belarus is where we have what's left in Europe of what's called the primeval forest that used to cover the whole of Europe. In the Second World War, the Bielski brothers, who were Jews, witnessed their mother and father being taken away by the Jews and executed. And the Bielski brothers decided that they would not let other Jews die. So they had to think about what could they do to save the Jews. So what they actually did was they set up what became a village or a small town right in the middle of the forest in Belarus. And what they also did was they decided that they just wouldn't defend, they would attack. So they formed a partisan army, and they killed several thousand Germans over the course of the Second World War. But at the end of the war, it's thought that they saved somewhere around about 1,600 Jews from the concentration camps, way more than Oskar Schindler did. And apparently if you go into the forest now, you can see the remains of this village where they built houses into the ground so that they'd be hidden from the Germans. 3 brothers who made a decision that they would not allow the status quo to remain. I've just finished reading the account of their lives. And what's interesting, is that when the war ended, that part of Belarus was captured by the Russians. And you'll probably know that it was, for some people, it was just as difficult living under Russian occupation as it was living through the Germans in the Second World War. So the Bielski brothers fled, originally to Israel and then to America. But they fled with no recognition. So Oskar Schindler was celebrated by Israel. The Bielski brothers for many, many years went unrecognised until almost near the time of their deaths. And they were then recognised for the mighty acts that they'd done during the Second World War. When I was reading the account of them, I started thinking about what my response would have been if I'd have been involved in a conflict like the Second World War. I wondered, would I have fought in the way they did? Would I have defended in the way they did? Would I have possibly earned a reputation like they did? And I don't know, and hopefully none of us will ever be faced with that question. But I reminded myself that warfare is hugely important. A couple of weeks ago, Peter reminded us about the journey of the Israelites into the Promised Land. And you'll remember that it wasn't the case that they were just able to march into the land unopposed. In fact, they had to fight. And many of the problems that Israel faced in subsequent years were down to the fact that they did not destroy the inhabitants of Canaan totally, as God told them to do. And warfare is vitally important in God's economy. Right at the start of Judges, we read this: "These are the nations the Lord left to test all those Israelites who had not experienced any of the wars in Canaan. He did this only to teach warfare to the descendants of the Israelites who had not had previous battle experience." God wanted the Israelites to have battle experience. It's true, although we don't face a battle like the Second World War, we've been reminded already this morning, haven't we, through that word that Joy gave, that we face battles and issues in our lives. Our battle might be fighting doubts. It might be fighting fears. It might be fighting worries. It might be fighting in a struggle. It might be fighting against evil. Or it might be fighting apathy. And the New Testament makes it very, very clear that today you and I are in a battle. Paul said to Timothy, "Fight the good fight of the faith." Near his death he said, "I have fought the good fight." And you'll remember in Ephesians how he tells the church there to put on the armour of God. We've read about 3 mighty men, 3 warriors. Don't know if you picked up on what they did, but Josheb-Bashebeth killed 800 men in one encounter with a spear. He fought, he went to fight. And we see other examples of that in the Bible, don't we? Perhaps the most favourite one that we all like is David against Goliath, somebody who went out to fight. The second mighty man we read about was Eleazar. The Bible says there, he stood his ground. That was why he was a mighty man. And that might be, a good instance in the Bible of that might be Daniel, when he stood against the King Darius, and he eventually got thrown into the lion's den, but he stood his ground. The third mighty man that we read about was Shammah, and he defended the field of lentils from the Israelites. He defended. One man fought, one man stood his ground, and one man defended. Those three men did exploits. But you know, that's not why they were special mighty men. They were special mighty men because of what they did in response to what David said, which we went on to read. So in 2 Samuel, we can read the story about the fact that one day David was in battle again against the Philistines. In the story, we can read that he was at Cave Adullam. Cave Adullam means cave of refuge. Don't know if you remember, those of us who were at Beaches Road, just down the road was the Baptist church. Cave Adullam, place of refuge. And they were battling against the Philistines who were in the valley of Rephaim. Rephaim means valley of giants. They were fighting again against the giants. And we can read in the story, it was at the time of harvest, so it's probably long, hot days. And we read here that one day David was thirsty. And he says, "Oh, that someone would get me a drink of water from the well near the gate of Bethlehem." That's not the only well in Israel. There are probably thousands and thousands. He could have had a drink of water from anywhere. He said, "Oh, that someone would get me a drink of water from the well near the gate of Bethlehem." And Bethlehem was David's hometown. That's where he came from. You remember, he was the son of Jesse of Bethlehem. David was not just thirsty, he was homesick. And he says, "Oh, that somebody would go and get me a drink of water from there." And in the story, we read that three mighty men heard that. Probably those first three gentlemen that we read about. And the Bible tells us that what they decided to do was to go to Bethlehem to get that water. The story tells us that the garrison, the army of the Philistines, was at Bethlehem. So they had to break through that army to get to the well. They had to go at the peril of losing their lives. They weren't just going on a walk. I think it's, from what I've read, about 14 miles away from Cave Adullam. They didn't just have to walk 14 miles and go to the well. They had to march and break through the Philistine army to get the water. And they did that. They went and got David the water. And when it's brought back, David realizes that that water was brought to them at the cost of those men's lives. They'd risked everything for David. So he realized he couldn't drink the water. It needed to be poured out to the Lord as a sacrifice. You know why that was a great mighty act and why we know that from the story? Because when we read about the next mighty man, we read about somebody called Abishai. And it tells us there that he was a mighty man because he raised his spear against 300 men whom he killed. But the Bible says he was not included among the three. We read about Benaiah, son of Jehoiada. He was a valiant fighter. It says, he went down into a pit on a snowy day and killed a lion. And he struck down a huge Egyptian. Although the Egyptian had a spear in his hand, Benaiah went against him with a club. But he was not included among the three. Two men who did exploits, mighty acts, but they were not recognized like those three who went and got the water for David. So what was it that made those three mighty men so special? Well, those three were completely devoted to their commander. They were devoted to their king, to David. They were prepared to give their all to him. They were attentive. They were listening to what he said. They heard him say, "Oh, that somebody would get me water from the well." They were courageous and they conquered their fears because it was their desire to please their commander. That was the warfare that they were involved in, and that's why they were three mighty men. That devotion to their commander set them apart from the others. That's why only the three are included as the three great mighty men. And I was thinking, can you imagine what happened when David stood before the Lord? And when those three men are there with him, and David says to the Lord, "Can I introduce you to my three mighty friends?" What an accolade for them that they were recognized as mighty men. And I was thinking, what if in the Lamb's Book of Life, where we read of those who are saved and those who are unsaved, what if there's another column? And the column on the right-hand side says, mighty man. And there's either a tick or a cross. And of course, it wouldn't just be mighty men, it might be mighty woman, tick or cross. Thank you, Marie. Lord, wouldn't it be fantastic for us if when we come to the end of our days, we knew that God was going to say to us, "Well done, you mighty man." And that opportunity is open to us because we can do exploits just in the same way as those three mighty men did exploits for David, because they were devoted to their commander. And we can be devoted to our commander, Jesus. They were attentive to everything he said, and we can be attentive to everything Jesus says. They were prepared to give their all, even their very lives, and we can be the same. We can be prepared to give our very lives to Jesus. And they conquered all of their fears, and we can do the same because their desire to please their commander can be just the same for us. So we've read about the mighty men. We've spoken about war. I've mentioned about the Bielski brothers and the legacy and the reputation that they now have. Let me leave you with that thought about the book of life. Wouldn't it be fantastic if against next to your name it said, mighty man or mighty woman, because of the exploits that we do going forward? Would you like to stand with me for a moment? We're just going to close with a recognition to our commander, to Jesus. Ray's going to lead us in the refrain, "All hail the Lamb." And as we do that, let's sing this as a group of Jesus's mighty men and women who were determined to be mighty men and women, just like those soldiers were for King David. Thanks, Ray.